Hi everyone, welcome tonight to my monthly Facebook Live event. Thanks for coming, and I hope there's a lot to talk about tonight. I've already received some questions in advance that I'll answer, but I also really entertain some of the questions you have as well. So there's a lot to talk about. A lot's happened in the last month. The biggest story, of course, for all of us is COVID and how it's affecting us, especially going into this holiday season. And I know Calgarians everywhere are doing everything they can to minimize the spread. I'm glad that we still have businesses open in Calgary, although there have been some that had to close. It's unfortunate, but nevertheless, let's stay safe together and make sure we get through this and come out the other side. I'm looking forward to a good holiday season. I'm sure all the rest of you are. Let's talk about what's happened in the last month or so. Bunch of community association meetings that I was able to attend, virtually most of them, although there was one or two that I was able to attend personally, and those include Inglewood, where I actually had a town hall, virtual, actually showing up. People came and visited me right at the Inglewood Community Center. We had a really good event there. It was on a Saturday afternoon. But we also went to Cliff Bungalow virtually, Mount Royal, Killarney Glengarry, where we went personally and had a really good meeting. We also went to Scarborough virtually, and these were all good meetings. You think about how people are getting through this pandemic. They're all getting together, and you think about a way an AGM is often held for these associations. It doesn't make that much difference as long as everybody gets heard. And I know I miss it too, everybody getting together, but we have to do what we have to do until we come through the other side of this pandemic. A lot on my plate, as you know, because I'm the critic for natural resources in our caucus, and not mining week was 2 weeks ago. So I had a lot of meetings with mining companies and the Mining Association of Canada about what the government needs to be doing better. They've adjusted well because they produce tangible products, and a lot of tangible products in Canada have done well during the pandemic. The best, of course, is forestry. You take a look at how forestry has performed from a pricing perspective so well. All the mills are busy. A lot of employment still happening in the forestry sector. Mining is the same. Mining needs more transparency of the horizon as far as things like the Impact Assessment Act, which they didn't think applied to them specifically when that was passed. You'll recall that was Bill C-69, the infamous No More Pipelines Act. It actually affects the Mining Association now as much as it affects almost every other industry, as we always thought it would. I also had the pleasure this past week of introducing a bill. That bill is a result of a difficult process. The way it happens in Parliament is every Parliament, you have a draw about who gets ranking in the private members' bills. And I drew number 11, so that's pretty high if you think there's 338 MPs, and I came up number 11. My first private members' bill was about allowing oil and gas wells to qualify as qualified environmental trusts. And that was proceeding through the process. And about midway, the Liberals found a way to find it out of order because they said suddenly it needed a Ways and Means motion. It's a bridge it had seemed we crossed early. Nevertheless, getting into the weeds a little too much on it, it was ruled to be out of order, and I had to come up with a new private members bill. And that happened last Friday. It's Bill 262, and I'm very proud that we introduced a bill to allow a tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The neat thing about this tax credit is we've allowed it to be transferable, because if you think about carbon capture, utilization, and storage, the carbon capture is an important part of getting less carbon into our atmosphere. The storage and the utilization are the other part of that process, and the value between those two is often disconnected. We want to make sure there's the ability to transfer that credit between the different entities, that is the ones that capture the carbon and the ones that actually utilize it or store it. The economics need to make sense for both sides. It's also linked to the current carbon price. So whatever is the price the government has here, if they believe in their carbon price, if they believe in what they're doing, they should support this bill in its entirety. And I'm looking forward to that getting through the House of Commons as quickly as possible. It took some doing because it's the first time, and we consulted with some tax experts on this, and the House of Commons hadn't seen this before either, but it's the first time there's actually a transferable tax credit available in Canadian law. So Something new, but something that works particularly well. And we modeled it after US legislation. Canada is a leader in carbon capture and storage, but it's lost ground in the last 2 years because the US has caught up with us because they have a similar type of instrument in the United States. We're going to gain that leadership back. We're a great country, we have great resource industry, and it's another way of us improving the environmental performance of our resource industry. What else has happened in Parliament? Well, last week in particular, I think you saw the government come out with their clean fuel standard. That was a big file for me and for my colleague Dan Albus, who's the critic for environmental affairs, and he and I work very closely. We've met a lot of associations regarding what the Liberals had put forward as their proposed clean fuel standards. And it's that typical bait and switch we get from the government all the time. They're actually looking at what would be the equivalent of a $350 per ton carbon charge on industry within the clean fuel standard. They watered that down significantly about how it affects industry, but they upped the price to the consumer. That's going to go up by, in 2 years, by $15 per year, up to $170 per ton in 2030. So that's quite a price that we're going to be paying for carbon. It's about 32 cents a liter more than we're paying right now for our gas storage. The trick with the Liberals is they always say that, well, we're going to pay you that money back, and now we're going to do it quarterly. So I don't know how they expect, when they take money away at the pump and when you're heating your home, and then cycle it back through to you in some kind of tax rebate, how that's accomplishing anything. It does seem like a bit of a shell game to me at the end of the day. At the end of the day, we're going to oppose this, of course, because we don't think it adds any value to either the environmental equation or, of course, to our taxability in Canada. It makes us, again, less competitive, particularly with our main trading partner, the United States. And that's something we always have to have top of mind. We don't want to have jobs starting up in the United States that aren't as efficient in Canada because of what we call carbon leakage. That is, we'll still produce those goods, it'll have the same carbon footprint, but they'll be produced in the United States. All the taxes, all the revenue will be in the States, all those costs will be borne in Canada. So that's one of the things we always like to make sure that we look at this from a good policy perspective. Also last week, the Parliamentary Budget Officer came out with a report on Trans Mountain Pipelines expansion, and it came out with the result at the end of the day from a net present value perspective was that it was still positive, even though there's been $5 billion worth of extra costs loaded into the pipeline's expansion. And that's a result of much extended process, redone process because they didn't do it right the first time, and it's the government officials that didn't do it right the first time. It's not the proponent that owned it before the government took it over. I pointed out to the Parliamentary Budget Officer that what they were missing in their financial analysis was the result for the country. And the result for the country is very important. What it does for the country is effectively right now we are transferring wealth, about $16 billion per year, to our trading partners, primarily the United States, because of the mispricing of the oil we currently export to the United States. Having this pipeline give us more egress capabilities will mitigate the current formula by about $6 billion a year. $6 billion a year of our most valuable export resource is significant to the value of our Canadian economy. So that alone justifies it way above anything else in the report. And that's important for our country going forward. That's about all I have to say as far as my report. Although I do want to talk about a bill that passed through Parliament last week, and that's Bill C7, the medical assistance in dying. Now, I remember when I campaigned to be here in Calgary Centre, a lot of constituents asked me my position on medical assistance in dying, and I'm a person that believes in people's ability to choose their end-of-life options when that's in front of them. And that's effectively what this bill did. Is it a perfect bill? No. And I supported my party's amendments to try and make sure there was some care taken there for people that might be moved in a direction there that might not necessarily be the right direction for them. Those amendments didn't pass. And then the bill came forward, the government bill came forward without the amendments. I still supported the government bill, along with about 12 of my colleagues. The rest of my party voted against medical assistance in dying. But I'm happy to make sure, I've heard so many stories about people that have had end of life issues that if this was available to them in a more, a better format, it would have made all the difference in the world. So I think it campaigned pretty clearly on this in the last election, and I want you to know that I did what I said I would do, and it's actually really what I believe. I believe that we all have the right to choose our last days and how we spend those. Thank you. I'm going to go to questions now, and some of those questions have come in ahead of time, so I know what they are. So I kind of have an ability to kind of get a little ahead of the answers. Some of them are coming in as we speak. Kristen from the Beltline asks, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused increasingly insurmountable challenges for women's rights organizations in Canada. These organizations provide a vital lifeline to communities, and especially women, providing essential services and programs. What are you doing to ensure that the existing gains made in policy to advance women's rights and gender equality are maintained by the federal government? Good question. And one of the things that this pandemic has resulted in is you take a look at the service sector economy and how much more it's been affected than the actual goods part of the economy. Tangible goods are still being produced, as we talked about in my preamble, throughout the country. A lot of forestry is doing very well. Mining's got a good head of steam behind it. Pretty soon, I think the tangibility of our energy sector, if it's unconstrained, will actually pick up as well. Services, on the other hand, things like restaurants, tourism, these have been hit particularly hard. And coincidentally, that's where you get an overrepresentation of women in the workforce. And that's something we need to adjust. So it's one of those structural issues in our economy that we didn't realize how vulnerable certain sectors were before this pandemic, and suddenly it's become very clear. I've also seen the statistics where we actually show that women of color are actually the ones who are actually the most affected by this. Women are affected, badly, worse than men, but women of color are actually even worse affected. So this whole service economy and who participates in that and how they're exposed in an event like COVID has become very clear. And I think it's part of the structural adjustments we need to make in our Canadian economy going forward to make sure we don't have such exposed demographics. To be seen, but this is one of the things that we need to look at and address as a society. Hope that answers the question. Moving target. Amber Ruddy-Jelena asked me, "Hi Greg, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Liberals' newly announced hydrogen strategy. Thank you." So the hydrogen strategy was just released today, and it's an interesting strategy, but it's about 100 and some pages, and honestly, I didn't get through it all the way today. We looked at it very quickly, we skimmed through it, and there's nothing new in there that really isn't included in the Clean Fuel Standard that came out on Friday. So it's a marketing document more than anything else. It does talk about the different types of renewable hydrogen and also the hydrogen we have here in Alberta and how we transition to the lower carbon economy. Hydrogen has less carbon in it, obviously, than other hydrocarbons, but in many ways we can get it from our natural gas reservoirs here in Alberta and in Western Canada. To make sure we transition that way effectively, so we're decarbonizing, as we say, we have to make sure that the actual process works, the midstream activities aren't affected badly. So it is a bit of a moving target how we get through this and make sure it works through our current infrastructure at a level that doesn't cause deterioration and still is safe throughout society. It's interesting, and I'm looking forward to actually reading the full report. And thanks for the question, Amber. Eddie Ho asks, some countries have shortened travel quarantine down to 10 days based on recent COVID research. Many countries allow even shorter quarantines or waived quarantine if there's a negative COVID test. Can we lobby the federal government to work to catch up with science and improve their policies sooner rather than later? Eddie, we are consistently working with the government on all kinds of approaches to this. I know my colleague Michelle Rempel is incessant about, can you get us rapid tests? Get rapid tests. The key to this, to keeping our economy moving, of course, is rapid tests. And I've spoken to my friends at WestJet as well, and for them, their business plan is entirely dependent on the fact that people travel and that rapid tests are available to make sure that we're quarantined for the period when we come back, and yet when those rapid tests happen and we actually get some clearance, that gets us back into opening up the economy. WestJet thinks it'll get people traveling again. Because of what they've done, they've opened up that ability here at the Calgary airport. And that is an experimental, a trial period for 26 weeks. And I hear it's going well. So a 26-week period, and then that the federal government's going to look at that, how that worked in Calgary, and see if they can apply it across Canada. But there's a lot of moving parts here, and I'm hopeful that this one, as it rolls out, it's Calgary specific about how we're making sure that our travel companies, our tourism companies have the ability to attract markets and make sure that we actually continue to keep this economy open. Thanks, Eddie. Wyatt Claypool, what are you or the other CPC doing to try to ensure the small business worst hit by COVID-19 are getting targeted support rather than the business community in general, regardless of economic performance? Well, Wyatt, that's a good question. There's two ends to this. You take a look at how people respond to this. Either everybody gets it and you push the money out as quickly as possible, or you actually target who should be getting it. The problem with the latter, of course, is there's a whole bunch of paperwork, a whole bunch of bureaucracy, a whole bunch of testing, and whether the people are eligible. The problem with the other solution is that we're throwing money against a wall, and we're going to have to recoup it at the end of the day through the tax system. So there's your two alternatives. The government, you recall, in the initial approach to the pandemic back in March and April, it went with as broad, almost as broad dispensation of money as possible. A lot of money went out the door. A lot of people received money that probably you can see some of the companies that didn't really require it. We've pointed some of those out. Companies that have done better during the pandemic than they did before the pandemic. Companies like furniture companies that we pointed out in the House of Commons. So holding the government to account on the actual results of their programs is important. I think getting a wage subsidy program was very important because so many employers were becoming disconnected with their employees. Having that quickly available for employers was a very important part of the pandemic response. And I think it resulted in not a lot of cutting ties between the employer and the employees. So it allows that relaunch to happen very quickly. But you're right, no matter what side of this equation you're on, there is going to be money that goes out the door that isn't accountable. I hope that answers your question. There's no perfect answer to that, but we are pushing the government hard on how we see people that should be eligible falling outside the cracks. Following up on those that wouldn't be eligible is part of the government's process at this point. I have a question from Pete, a local business owner. Current contact tracing and business restrictions have, unfortunately, had limited success in controlling the pandemic. The byproduct has been that many small businesses are being seriously damaged. What can be done to improve contact tracing and safe access to business while we wait for vaccine distribution? Contact tracing is one of those things. I know the feds have an app on it. I downloaded it because I'm between two provinces, and it hasn't gone off once. Contact tracing, there's all kinds of different apps out there. I know that I met yesterday with another app developer that thinks it'll be very good for particularly restaurants. Getting these things into the equation about how people that might be exposed get that quick contact about being exposed, I think would add a significant amount of value. Business models matter. Obviously getting into the value chain and making sure our businesses stay open, very important. But this is a coordinated approach between mostly the provincial governments, because business is a provincial matter in our Constitution, by and large. And this is where all these different applications have come across provincially before. That's where we actually have to make sure that the tracing that happens, the corollary to that I've had some pushback on, of course, is privacy. And it is, again, in government, a balance. And I know that the governments that are looking at this are trying to maintain that balance, make sure we're all trying to stay safe, and make sure people that are upset about how much of your information they're sharing aren't too put off. And in the end, results matter. Are we doing something that has a quantifiable result that keeps our businesses open and keeps our population healthy? Those are the things we have to measure. Those measurements aren't available right now. I wish they were. Thank you. Question from Mark, a local business owner. I believe that the trillions being spent at these green initiatives are a way for politicians to feel better about themselves and are simply financially encumbering our future generations. I believe that the deemed cure is worse than the disease. We've geared up for the past 100 years to become world class at energy exploitation in the most humane, socially, culturally, and environmentally sensitive manner possible. I recognize we will probably never get back to the leading technological edge Calgary has enjoyed, and sadly, most Canadians seem comfortable with this level of widespread mediocrity. What does this bode for future entrepreneurs, even my kids? Excellent question, Mark. And in so many ways, you're right. In so many ways, what does this bode for the future? I look at the deficits we're running, the lack of accountability, the government's throwing money at the wall in its future programming, not just its COVID programming, but its future programming for all kinds of economic change that it wants to see. Don't let a crisis go to waste mentality. Billions upon billions are going out the door to nibble around to try and change business models that supposedly didn't work. This is wrong. We have had a really good business climate here in Calgary. We've had a great business model in Canada for a long time. I recall when free trade initially happened, and I remember having this discussion with my wife and my stepson at the time when he went to go look at going to Queens and Kingston at that point in time. And we went to Kingston, and this goes back just a handful of years, and it was a beautiful city. But I remember Kingston back when I was a student, and it was actually pretty run down. Free trade changed our economy in Canada significantly over 3 decades. We added some significant value to Canada. Trade went up, prosperity went up, Canadians' medical and social programs went up. We did very well as a society. And you're right, we're kind of tossing that to the wind right now. It is a new way of thinking about things, and this is the heartbreaking part for me when I'm in Ottawa, is that this government is democratically elected. And part of what they're doing is part of what they ran on. There's a lot they're doing that I don't think they ran on, like this whole great reset they think should happen at this point in time. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't paying attention to what's really going on here. We do need to get people resonated around what is actually happening with our economy and what our future looks like. Because right now, you're right, we're going heavily into debt. There is no way outside of debt, outside of collecting more money to pay off that debt at the end of the day. Anybody that says it just continues spinning our wheels on that debt hasn't looked at reality in a long time. We need to pay off our debt, and we are saddled with debt. $1.1 trillion of federal debt at this point in time. On top of that, a gross amount of provincial debt across the 10 provinces. We need to get this under control. I know you're probably on side with me with that. We need to convince a lot of Canadians about that. But thanks for the question, Mark. I hope that answered your question, and if you want to talk about it further, I'm open for a call. Vaughn Lecharit asked me a question. You voted yay for C7 along with 14 other Conservatives, where 103 Conservatives voted nay. This does not look like the norm. The norm looks like all political affiliation members vote together, regardless of affiliation. I find it hard to believe that constituents really think like that. How can this change to represent actual constituent views? Vaughn, thanks for the question. I did address part of it in my opening remarks, but I will say again, I voted for people to have the right to choose medical assistance in dying. That bill did pass through the House of Commons and is now in the Senate, looking for some amendments in the Senate. It is one of those moral issues, and in my party it was a free vote. So you can see that 14 Conservatives, as you say, 14 Conservatives voted for that, and over 100 of them voted against that motion. The reason that my colleagues voted against that motion is because a lot of them want to have some controls in there to make sure that people aren't pushed towards a decision at end of life that isn't well considered, particularly people that are not as able-bodied as other people. They want to make sure that it isn't a default position for certain members of our society, that all kinds of resources are still allocated towards people with needs and people that have needs that require significant resources. And that's exactly what our amendments were supposed to do. I voted for those amendments, and in the end I still voted for the fact that we need to have mercy at end-of-life options. And I recall campaigning on that in the last election, and people, my constituents, were very aware of my position on this, and I hope I've fulfilled their expectations. I know that it is a tough moral issue, and I appreciate that I can't represent both sides of the equation at the same time. You can see my vote, and I'm proud of my vote, and thank you for the question. Alexa from South Calgary asks, as it's written, Bill C-11 places businesses on equal footing with people, but my rights as an individual over my own personal information should come ahead of businesses' rights to use and profit off that information. I'm asking you to call for the bill to recognize privacy as a human right of higher inherent standing than business convenience. Also, please support amendments of the bill to include political parties and nonprofit organizations in its coverage. We know that political parties are using personal information to inform their campaign, and the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal demonstrated the negative consequences this can have on our democratic processes. To leave these organizations outside the scope of this legislation is a major and unjustifiable oversight. Alexa, thank you. You're right. C-11, for everybody's information, is the right to privacy of information, and it is. And I spoke to the bill in the House of Commons, and I raised some of the same questions you did, Alexa, about who actually owns this information. Because when you read the legislation put forward by the government, the only thing it really does is it fines corporations and up to $25 million or 5% of their worldwide income based on the fact that they've misused somebody's financial information. But the person whose information they've misused doesn't collect that money. The government collects that money. So it's a bit of a misaligned, if you ask me, about who's benefiting from the fact that somebody might be profiting from your information. I can say personally, the only time that my information has been leaked and misused was by the government. And government's the only people that really I have to supply my direct legal information to so that it's entirely correct. They know my taxes, they know what I make, they know a whole bunch of things about me that most organizations don't know. And so for a government to be the leak of that information to other organizations is actually a bigger problem, I think, than large organizations doing it. However, I strongly believe that people shouldn't be profiting off of our own individual personal information. It's ours. We need to make sure it's protected, and we need to make sure it applies. So at the end of the day, an onerous bureaucratic bill put forward by government doesn't make it so much harder for small businesses to actually administer the visa transactions they have to undertake on a daily basis. There's the balance again. So the cost of compliance versus the actual implementation about the information. I think really it's the bill I've seen is geared towards large corporations to the benefit of the government. It needs substantial amendments to it. But thank you very much for the question. Question from Sandra from South Calgary. Sandra says, as a concerned Albertan mother and grandmother, I am very concerned about the testing of this new vaccine. I'm very concerned that it is an mRNA vaccine that the government is promoting, which can genetically modify our DNA for generations to come. How can the government be forcing us, and especially our children, to get this vaccine? Sandra, I had the pleasure this morning of listening to Tyler Shandro, Alberta's Minister of Health, and we, as the Alberta Caucus federally, invited him to inform us on many of these approaches that the provincial government is taking towards the pandemic response. And Minister Shandro made it quite clear to us that there is no thinking about mandatory vaccines in Alberta. Happy to hear that. I hope you're happy to hear that. Any vaccine, of course, should continue to be personal choice. These are also provincial jurisdictions, so the federal government will not be able to come in and say you have to do this. These are being administered by the province, and as I said, Minister Shandro told us today that there is no appetite in Alberta or amongst the government to make sure that those vaccines are mandatory. I hope that clearly answers your question, Sandra, and I hope it satisfies your concerns. Farzana, a resident of Altadore and a business owner in Marteloup, asks, I started my business in January 2020, signed a lease for a space in Marteloup and hired 2 employees. I barely started the business when I was forced to close and terminate my staff in March. At the time that we closed our doors, I had made 0 revenue as we were still in the startup phase. I was disappointed to learn that I do not qualify for the first 2 because they require a drop in revenue as shown by the amount earned during January or February 2020. I imagine that I am not alone. There are likely many small businesses which were launched in February and March 2020 which are victims of the same fate. As our MP, I feel that you could push for a process for considering individual businesses such as mine on a case-by-case basis. Yes, Farzana, I guarantee you, I heard about this immediately when the programs came out in the spring. That why am I outside of this? I've been shut down, but I have a startup business and suddenly I'm not eligible for keeping my employees on staff because of the way these programs are designed. We pushed the government hard on that. They accommodated some of these by switching to a month-to-month revenue decline, and I realize that you had 0 revenue even at your startup, and yours is one of the ones that fell right through the cracks. If you wrote me a letter on this and told me exactly, the situation, what kind of business it was, because they're also looking at that as far as what businesses would be eligible for this, I would see what we can push for on this. I know it looks like we're about 8 months late from when you actually needed this assistance, and I apologize for that. We were inundated with questions just like this in the initial programming, and we worked tirelessly, my colleagues, and not just my colleagues in the Conservative side of the House, but the backbenchers on the Liberal side of the House, in the NDP, in the Bloc Québécois, of all of the businesses and individuals across the country that seem to fall outside the programming that should have been eligible for some kind of support so we could relaunch quickly from this pandemic. So my regrets that you weren't accommodated in the first round of programming. Please send me a letter and I'll see what I can lobby with the minister on to see how that might fit within their new round of programming. Tyler Zoots asked me, if most MPs are sitting at home, shouldn't we lay them off? Good question, Tyler. I used to say the same thing about the entire, everybody that was paid for by public funds at this point in time. If you're doing nothing, why are private sector employees that have been laid off living on CERB and public sector employees living on the same salary they always have, and yet they're both performing the same function in a COVID economy? It's that whole issue of public choice, as we call it. Those people making the decisions are the people that are actually, how is it affecting them first of all, and then but I've always said, put those people in the shoes of the people they're affecting, and they should make better decisions. I can tell you most MPs have been working through this in many ways because a lot of public services were not available. We acted as frontline offices. Our phones were ringing off the hook. My staff has worked tirelessly in making sure that we're trying to get through all of this COVID programming. So I'm not sure that the same thing applies to MPs as applies to some other parts of the public service. And I've heard those complaints many times, and I appreciate that there's 2 sides to that discussion, but it does seem to be a bit of a dichotomy of how we're dealing with different parts of our economy. Some are laid off and living on a very modest income through this pandemic, and some are carrying on with little activity and payroll as usual. So it is something we need to talk about, and politicians should be the ones at the lead of that, and I hope I have been. Thank you, Tyler. Letitia from Sun Alta asks, better protections for human health and the environment have never been more important. That's why I support moving forward with modernization of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, Canada's Toxins and Pollution Law. CEPA, as it's called, has not been updated for more than 2 decades, and scientific understanding of the risks have changed. We need strong environmental laws to protect human health as well as the environment. Will you support modernizing CEPA? The answer, of course, Letitia, is yes. Modernizing all of these acts is very important. Things are changing very quickly. Even the definition of toxic, if you think about what the problem is with the government's latest ban on plastics, it considers our plastics to be actually a toxic substance. Now, who knew all along that The non-recyclable plastics that contain our personal protective equipment through this pandemic are actually covered in what we consider to be, in 1 year's time, a toxic material. And that's a problem in definition. We have to start looking at how these things interact and look at our pollution laws and how they affect human life and human health going forward. We're advancing very quickly on this. I'm actually looking at how we address our economy in Alberta going forward. This is one of those things where it only comes to the forefront of my understanding because of the way it was applied to Alberta's plastics industry. We need to address it. We need to make sure our definitions are correct, and we need to move forward on environmental issues so that they adapt to the latest science. Thank you very much. The question here from Lee. While Calgary has made some steps towards poverty reduction, the pandemic has exposed a lot of inequalities within Calgary. Generally, those who were already vulnerable are hit harder. Meatpacking plants and care facilities disproportionately represent low wages, women, people of color, and new Canadians. Can you provide some comment on poverty within Calgary and Alberta as a whole? Exactly right. Lee, we talked about this earlier in the podcast, in the webcast here. The services, but also if you think about the hard labor part of our economy has been hit very much so. The people that have been required to come into work on a regular basis. I know we talk about our heroes in the healthcare system, and they've done an excellent job. I also think about the heroes at my 7-Eleven when I have to go home and pick up milk when for dinner. And that's one of the things as well. Those people have handled this pandemic very well, and I know they're not at the top of the earning scales in Canada. They've done very well. We want to make sure that they're covered through this process, and I'm happy to see how they've adjusted. Poverty exists in Calgary, and poverty exists in Calgary Centre. I've knocked on doors here that are, I think, the poorest doors I've ever knocked on, and in some of the neighborhoods, some of the doorbells didn't even have doors that were closing, and obviously apartments where our most marginalized citizens live. Making sure those people are taken care of through this pandemic has been very important, and we're doing everything we can. Unfortunately, sometimes government systems don't track those people effectively. Making sure they're taken care of, everybody needs to reach out and ensure the government programs reach them as much as everybody else. I hope that answers your question and how we deal with this process going forward. Next question, Bill from downtown West End asks, I'm a retired person who works part-time. I applied for the CERB, but now I'm told I have to repay because my net income didn't reach the $5,000 threshold. But when I applied, my gross income did. Can you explain the change? Yes, I can, Bill. This is CRA's mistake because there's been numerous questions raised on this. When people were calling the CRA to see if they're eligible, they said, this is my gross income, and CRA said, you are eligible, and it has been recorded that way. And now they're saying, well, we meant net. Now, I don't know if you've ever dealt with CRA, Bill, but I'll tell you that they are an organization that's very difficult to deal with. And even the motions we put in Parliament as far as how CRA needs to stand down from auditing people in the midst of this pandemic, small businesses in particular, has been not obeyed at this point in time. We're pushing the government on that, but the CRA, I think, does need to look at how they're actually affecting people with what is false information at the front end. And they're saying, look, mistakes are made, tough luck, now you have to pay it back. We're trying to push hard saying, if people relied in good faith on the information they were given by the CRA, then you need to be able to adjust to them at this end. If it was gross when they called, gross income, then it should be applied on gross income now. We're pushing on that. It's an ongoing issue. Sorry you're wrapped up in that, Bill, but I hope that helps. Please stay tuned. David Robinson asks, any comment on the impacts on Alberta and your riding of the increases in the federal carbon tax just announced by PM Trudeau? Yes, David. $170 going up to 2030 is going to be severe for the economy here. The big thing we have to talk about here, and the government in its endless virtue signaling is talking about the price on carbon. I know when I was in private equity, we tried to assess the price on carbon. We looked at it between the actual social cost of carbon not to get too deep in the weeds on this, being between $20 and $50 per ton of CO2. Now, appreciate that is a number out there. 170 is a way of virtue signaling and making one part of our economy more expensive so that another part of our economy looks better in comparison. We do have to get ahead of carbon. And one of the things that I put on the table here is the carbon capture and utilization bill. There are better ways to do this than just adding more and more tax to people to make it onerous for us vis-a-vis our trading partner, the Americans. This is the justification that the Minister of Natural Resources told me. He says, we have to keep up with the Americans because the new administration in America is going to move on carbon. And I challenged him on that. I said, we are already so far ahead of the Americans on our pricing of carbon, we are no longer competitive. And what that means, of course, is when a new refinery, a new biofuel refinery, a new manufacturing plant is built, it'll be built in the United States because we have a trade agreement. And that means we're buying goods because the cost of producing something in Canada is onerously expensive compared to what it is with our free trade partner in the United States. This is going to impact us very much going forward. We need to address it. I will point out that it was that bait and switch they did with what they put out there as the trial on what the clean fuel standard would look like, and what they switched to at the end to make it more palatable to business. It's still not very good, but it looks better than what they initially put forward. And that's their typical bait and switch, put out a trial balloon and come in with something half as bad as the egregiously bad proposal they've had on the table. First of all, it still will be very bad for our economy. We need to adjust it, and hopefully, David, we become government and we can actually adjust for these things going forward. We'll have better ways of adjusting for carbon and making sure that we meet our environmental commitments going forward. Thank you. Darren is my next question. He says, I would be interested in your insight regarding Prime Minister Trudeau's continued popularity and support in Central and Eastern Canada. The following does not seem to negatively impact his popularity. Multiple ethics investigations, no fiscal control or accountability, proroguing Parliament, lying about carbon tax increases. I didn't say that. Darren said that. I used more parliamentary language, but I think the point is being made. Rarely, if ever, answering a question in Parliament with a straight answer. I'm glad people are noticing. Supporting the Great Reset, supporting oil imports from Saudi Arabia and other countries at the expense of domestic production, which is cleaner. How can the Conservatives overcome this support for Trudeau in the East? I think Darren might be a fan of mine, because Darren and I agree with you 100%. Frustrating sitting there watching the leader of a government avoid questioning, prattle on about whatever he wants to talk about in question period. Where is the media in exposing what this man is saying and exposing what he's doing to this country? It's galling to sit there in the House of Commons and watch this unfold. Part of our democratic process is that he's the Prime Minister, but part of our democratic process is that they have to answer questions in question period. And I don't know where it fell off the map so much that now they're not answering questions. They say whatever they want to say, and nobody holds them to account on that. I think that's the Speaker's responsibility, and it's not being fulfilled very well at this point in time. I know in other parliaments around the world, if the person answering the question is deviating or not answering the question, the Speaker does hold them to account on it. We need to get back to that process here, where we actually have people that are asking questions that deserve to get answered, because it is about public accountability at the end of the day. That's the nature of our democracy. That's the nature of question period. And right now it's being avoided. So I'm as flabbergasted as you are, and we keep at it, and hopefully somebody picks it up, and hopefully people are listening to our message about what a better Canada looks like going forward. We need to resonate with Canadians on this. We'll keep at it. Darren, thanks for the question. Marina Fedorov says, has the current carbon tax changed anything? Will money change the weather? Well, Marina, you take a look at where we actually are on a carbon basis. The world is still carbonizing. There's all kinds of coal plants being built still in parts of Asia. Coal is cheap and dirty, and we are getting off coal here because we recognize There are all kinds of environmental effects associated with coal, not just the greenhouse gases, but the black carbon that causes some chemical changes as well. Soot is a bad thing. Burning causes pollution. These are things we need to address, but we need to address all of our environmental challenges. Will money change the weather? No. You take a look at what we have to do. We have to look at ways to make sure that we get a better planet here, and that includes all kinds of measures about how we're improving the environment. Often that will require money, looking for better ways of doing things that are better for the health of all of us. Getting the environmental message of the day that has the most resonance, of course, is greenhouse gas reduction. I think many of the ways that the current government is approaching greenhouse gas reduction are foolhardy. They're uneconomical. There are better ways of doing it that are better for the economy, that aren't as economically onerous as what they're looking to do. And yet we're not exploring those options. We're hoping to put those on the table. Like I say, I can reiterate again that the carbon capture, utilization, and storage bill I put on the table last Friday is a great way of actually motivating businesses to actually sequester carbon and go forward. Environment's important. We also need to continue to build the greatest society that the world has known at this point in time. But thank you, Marina, for the question. Well, that looks like it for the questions. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. Some of those were kind of challenging tonight, I got to tell you, on both sides of the equation. It's my pleasure to meet with you periodically this way. But let me say tonight, because it is that time of year, Merry Christmas to everyone. Happy holidays. Happy Hanukkah. Whatever your faith, or whether you have none, please have a joyous festive season here. I will see you back in my next Facebook Live on January 20th at 6 p.m. And stay safe these holidays. Thank you, everyone. Good night.